Hey, everybody, this is Ben Bowman. Welcome back to another episode of The Oregon Bridge.
What actually happened on that, this is interesting, another part that I didn't write about, but during this attempted coup in the Republican caucus back in 95, they were going to try to, get her out as speaker. I think that in retrospect, you have to look at it in place and time. At the moment on that day, when that all came down, there's not a lot of plotting about, let me think about 2 years from now, right? It's just kind of like we're just moving ahead. And I think that everybody understood that our nominee was Kate Brown.
All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of the podcast. I was super excited today because I got to have a conversation with Rick Metsger. Those who have been following Oregon politics for a while will know Rick. He's a former state senator. He served for about a decade in the Oregon State Legislature. After he left the legislature, he was actually appointed by President Barack Obama to serve on the board of the National Credit Union Administration. He was eventually chair, and now he's back in Oregon, and he's going to be doing some legislative advocacy during the session. But the reason why we wanted to talk to Rick is he just wrote this essay, this two-part essay, that basically tells, for the first time that I'm aware of publicly, the story of basically how Peter Courtney became Senate president in his first session, and the conflict. I don't know if conflict might be a bit too strong of a word. The competition between Peter Courtney and Kate Brown, who also wanted to be Senate president and was the caucus leader at the time. There was this split chamber. There were these secret ballots. Rick has actually told the story. He interviewed 15 of his former colleagues who were in the Senate at this time, and he wrote this essay. He names names. He tells the story of who said what, how this happened, chronology. There's tears involved. There's broken promises allegedly involved. It's a highly dramatic story, but the reason why it's important is because, most folks know Peter Courtney is the longest serving Senate president in Oregon history. Kate Brown just finished her time as governor. These are two of the most influential figures in modern Oregon politics, and their trajectories, where they ended up today, started in that moment in a secret caucus meeting at Salishan. And so Rick tells that story, and we were really excited to chat with him. My co-host Reagan Knope was supposed to be here, but he's actually being a good family member and helping with a transportation need for folks in his family. So we missed Reagan this episode, but he'll be back next week. And yeah, with that, I hope you enjoy this conversation with Rick Metsger.
The lawyers at Harangue Longary Rudnick PC have represented both public and private sector clients in Oregon's political and policymaking arenas for decades. We have worked on some of the most consequential public policy matters in modern Oregon history, combining strategic savvy with technical expertise to help our clients navigate the legal, political, and governmental landscape to achieve their goals. To learn more about how Harangue Long can help you achieve your goals, go to harangue.com. That's HARRANG.com.
All right, Rick Metsger, thanks so much for joining the podcast. How are you?
You bet, Representative-elect. It's great to be here.
So we're going to get into this essay that you wrote, which, as I was saying, Reagan, I think, is one of the most interesting pieces in Oregon politics that we've read in years, about the intersection of Peter Courtney and Kate Brown's lives and careers and how they sort of ended up where they ended up. But you're not a sort of like neutral party from the outside in this story. You actually were a member of the state Senate for over a decade. So what's that story? How did you end up? I think 1999 was when you got elected. How did you end up in the state Senate?
Yeah, I was elected in 98. So 98 or 99 was the first session. I got into the Senate by coercion. Actually, it's a person who's still lobbying, Pam Levitt.
I know Pam, yeah.
And with the Oregon Credit Union League, and he had talked to me about running for the Senate. I was on the board of what was then Portland Teachers Credit Union. It's now called On Point Community Credit Union.
I'm a member.
And I was a citizen testifier on a bill the previous session that failed, and he said, you should run for the Senate, because the guy who was chairing the committee was in the district that I happened to live, and And it was like, we could really use your help here. And by the way, it's a part-time gig, and it's not hard to run. It doesn't take much. So why don't you do it? So I bit, and then before I could get off the hook, she had reeled me in. So then I realized, oh, this is nothing part-time about this. But that's actually how I first, got into politics in the first time. So I was
So
kind of a late
did you beat an incumbent?
not directly. Ken Baker, is a Republican from Happy Valley, was the chair of the business committee. And then he got primaried by someone more to the right of him, a guy named Grisham, who was the Clackamas County Commissioner, and Grisham beat him in the primary. And then I beat Grisham in the general election.
Got it.
So, it's just kind of how those things go sometimes. But I always blame Pam that it was her fault. So.
Well, Pam is a lovely person who lives in Tigard, my new district. So my former boss, Margaret Doherty, used to joke, I don't have to be nice to lobbyists unless they're my constituents. So Pam is a constituent.
See, make sure you know the map, right?
Yeah, exactly. So after you served in the Senate, and your background with Portland Teachers Credit Union and On Point sort of alludes to how this may have happened, but you got this prestigious federal role that you were like directly appointed by President Barack Obama to serve on the National Credit Union, the board of the National Credit Union Administration. How did that happen? How did you get picked out of Oregon to be?
That was interesting. That's one of, again, it's kind of serendipity. I had left the Senate, had a PR company at the time. And of course, I followed credit union stuff a lot. And I was the chair of the business committee in the Senate. So we did all the banking and credit, the legislation and all that kind of stuff. There was an appointment to the NCUA, which is the federal regulator for credit unions. So you have the FDIC, which is the federal regulator for the banks, and then the NCUA is for the credit unions. And they had an appointee to fill a vacant seat, I think in 2012. And that nominee did not get confirmed by the Senate. And so they had to reopen that again. And it was a couple of people that were really integral to that happening. Primarily was Jeff Merkley, who
Right.
I, of course, had served with in the legislature. He was in the Senate. He was on the banking committee, and of course that nominee had failed. And, early on, he suggested that might be something you'd be interested in, because you've got the background for that, with the legislative background, the credit union background, et cetera. He would be helpful if I was interested in doing that. So I said, wow, I'll apply for that. That's not going to happen. So I applied for that and didn't hear anything for 6 months and didn't expect ever to hear anything. And then it was around October of 2012.
Yeah.
I think it was July that I filled out the paperwork, right?
Yeah.
So then it was about October 2012, and I was talking to a former staffer of mine, James Zaleski. James is now a law professor at Lewis and Clark College.
Okay.
But he left our Senate Democratic office and went to work as a general counsel, assistant general counsel for the president when Obama was first elected. And he served for a couple of years and met the love of his life and moved back to Oregon and took a job at Lewis and Clark. So I was talking to James, and he said, I told him I did this. He says, oh, well, my desk was right next door to the head of the Office of Personnel. I know her really well. I said, well, I put this application in. If you wouldn't mind, would you mind just giving her a call and say I'm not a criminal? And maybe out of this stack of applicants, she might take a look at it. And I think that was critical because he actually talked to her. About 3 weeks later, it was early December at that point, and I got a call from the White House, and they said, "Can you be here in 2 days for an interview?"
Holy cow.
So
cancel some plans.
That's kind of what happened. I came in and went to the West Wing and had an interview, and a few days later, after they had made the rounds with the president, said, "You're going to be our nominee," and it all started that way.
So did you ever interact with like White House chief of staff or the president, or who were the people, like how
Not
inside?
really, not really. I mean, I met the president a couple times,
Uh,
but he had kind of a higher level of responsibility
some other things going on.
than me. There was a White House liaison that I worked with,
Okay.
one of the deputies,
And
and also through the whole financial regulatory network. So we had Federal Reserve, the FDIC, the NCUA, the SEC, and the comptroller of the currency. And we were on two other bodies, the FSOC, the Federal Financial Stability Oversight Council, and the Federal Financial Institutions Executive Council, FFIEC. So all of us, the heads of the department, also served in that capacity. And so we all work together and with the White House liaison on, different policies with the administration. And that was my major contact with the White House. I mean, I've got some napkins and, some M&Ms,
M&Ms, yeah.
for that, with the White House printed on them, I mean, that's
I
not bad.
I have two other questions on this before we jump into the story. One is vetting. Did they do they call all your friends and family and everyone you grew up with, and is that really how it worked?
Oh yeah, I'll never forget the time. I live on Court Street right here in Salem, just right up from the Capitol, historic neighborhood, and a nice little lady next door. I remember he said, "Oh, this is going to freak her out because I see this black car in front of her house with the guy, guy that just he looks like Fed, right?"
Yeah.
And I knew what was happening, going to interview her. I said, "Oh, this is going to freak her out. What's the Fed?" Because they can't tell anything. They want to know about you. They say, "Well, what's this about?" I'm sorry, ma'am, I can't. So they think everybody thinks you're
He's under
you're investigated for
yeah.
massive federal fraud or something. They as I remember doing my exit interview with the FBI. This took about 2.5 months. They had like 7 different FBI agents on this. I think they talked to 150 some odd people.
Cow.
And including my high school, my freshman college roommate, who I hadn't talked to in 40 years. They talked to him. I will tell you, it's a very, because it's a Senate nominee, you have to be approved by the Senate. So, they're very thorough about that. They know stuff about me that I didn't even remember. So,
so then my final question on this is, I noticed you served through January 22nd, 2017. That is not a random date. That is immediately after President Trump.
I served as chairman till then.
Yeah, so did you stay on the board after?
Yeah. So I was still on the board, but the president gets to pick the chairman. So needless to say, within 36 hours of Trump being elected, the Republican on the board was named to replace me as chairman, and I got back to just being a regular member of the board.
But you had a term in office that meant so President Trump could not remove you from the board, but
right.
He could replace you as chair.
Yes, exactly. So I served till 2019. So I served 2 years into the Trump administration. I was one of the last Obama holdovers. Every federal position is different, but in the federal financial network of agencies, the law specifies that those are terms that if you remember, there was a big brouhaha over the CFPB and some other things.
Yep.
That you can't be removed except for cause. So president probably would have loved to replace me, but
but he couldn't.
But he couldn't do that.
Yeah.
I stayed out of his life and he stayed out of mine. And that was fine.
And I assume this was a full-time paid position.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And you're living in DC during this time. Yeah.
Yeah. I come home to Oregon twice a month.
Wow.
For 4-day weekends. And, I share the airplane almost every other weekend with Suzanne Bonamici and Jeff Merkley and,
that's nuts.
Kurt Schrader. We became, seat buddies.
Yeah. Okay. So now let's rewind a couple decades in your previous life as a state senator. You wrote this essay for PacWest, who you work with now, their mailing list, and it's basically the story of how Kate Brown ended up, not how she ended up as governor, but how she narrowly missed something she wanted, which we'll talk about. Right. Peter Courtney ends up as Senate president, and that sort of sets their trajectories off following. So let's start in 1997. Kate Brown gets elected to the Senate in 1997, but it is a very different state Senate than what it looks like today. I believe you write that it was a 2010 Republican Senate.
Yeah. No walkout necessary.
No.
We got 20 here already. We don't need you for a quorum.
They have quorum without the R's. And so Kate Brown basically is a central figure in shifting the composition of the Senate and electing more Democrats. How does she do that? How does she go about shifting the Senate?
Well, I think first of all, she's very driven politically, and I mean, she went in, both feet. I mean, who wants to serve in a minority 20-10, right? And so the head of the Senate Democratic Caucus, and just a wonderful person, was Senator Cliff Trow. Out of Corvallis. He was a history professor at Oregon State University, and Cliff, I served with him for 2 terms actually. So Cliff, was a great policymaker. And he was a good thinker, but he was not a politician, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he was not somebody that had that fire in the belly or the wherewithal, in his own sphere of what is important, to go out there and actually hit campaign trails and help candidates and raise money. And so I think Kate saw that and said, well, I need to have that position, and to do that. And Cliff isn't going to do that. And so I'm just going to take it upon myself to start doing that. And so she was very active in the election, in the race that I was running and others. And spending time walking doors, spending time helping raise money, and so she was rewarded with that. I think Cliff was kind of ready to step down anyway, but it was clear that we needed new energy, and that Kate had displayed that, and so she became caucus leader in November after that election, and that's kind of how that got started.
So she becomes caucus leader, and she's chipping away every cycle. She's winning a few more seats. I think in 2002, she finally wins 1 additional seat. And
she won in 2000. We won another one. I think that was Ryan Deckert beat Eileen Cuto.
Yeah.
And then in 2002, we win another one, which brings us to the tie.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is where it gets sort of nuts. Is like you've got a tied chamber. This is even hard for me to imagine today. This happened in 2010, and it looked completely different than what happened in 2002. In 2010, they basically split everything, and it was pretty clear.
This is in the House now.
In the House. There's Arnie Roblin and Bruce Hanna. You've got co-speakers. Right. You've got co-chairs of committees. Like in 2002, there was really no precedent. I'm guessing you had a split chamber. Right. Nobody knew what to do, and basically it sounds like for several months they could not decide on who was going to be Senate president. They literally couldn't do anything.
2 months. Yeah.
So what is happening in those 2 months?
Well, they were, the negotiators were meeting all the time. We had 3 negotiators. The Republicans had 6, and they would meet, every week. And, they were accomplishing various things in terms of, how the committee structure would work, how the membership would work. And it evolved into what we called a memorandum of understanding of how we would share this balance, and so that kind of stuff got done. But when I got who was going to lead, it was very interesting. As I wrote about, there was initial talks about sharing the presidency, right, and the biggest issue for the Republicans was that they just absolutely would not have Kate Brown. And I understand that because they saw her as someone that's taken away, their power and everything that they've enjoyed for quite a few years. And so
was she perceived as like, I mean, she's from Southeast Portland. She's a member of the LGBT community. So I'm guessing, was the perception like, oh, she's a far left sort of person, or was it mostly about her role in the campaigns?
I think it's mostly about her role in the campaign as opposed to her philosophy, right? I mean, they just don't want to reward her any further from anything else, and they were adamant about that. And so, and we were insistent that Kate Brown, if we're going to share the presidency, she's
should
our
be the one.
nominee, right?
Yeah.
And so that led to a stalemate on that. The other part about it is, and I just wrote briefly about this, was that what was interesting. You mentioned the House in 2010. Obviously, they coalesced around Bruce Hanna and were able to find something. Republicans did not have a nominee. I mean, it was really quite funny that it seemed like there was of those 6 people in the negotiating table, every one of them wanted it,
To be
but none of them could get more than 2 votes themselves. And so we had a nominee, but they couldn't even get a nominee. And you saw what I wrote about, when it finally got down to maybe Bev Clarno. Well, there was 2 things. One I didn't actually write about. Was one of the ones early on was Len Hannon. Now, Len Hannon was the longest serving member of the Senate. So he was a senior member of the Republicans. But he was more of kind of a liberal Republican. He actually used to be a Democrat. He was elected originally as a Democrat in Southern Oregon. And one of the things that was early on in negotiations was there was a lot of mistrust of Len. They were we're going to have actually 2 Democrats as, he's going to give away the farm. So they really didn't want Len to be their guy. And then nobody else, they could get more than a couple of votes to do that. And so that's where, finally at some point, it became clear that someone is going to have to be president because the sharing thing wasn't going to work. And so then it became who is going to be one that's acceptable enough on both sides to have that.
And it's Bev Clarno who suggests initially Peter Courtney, right?
Yeah, because Bev was, when they're getting down nitty gritty, we're getting ready to start session and still don't have a president. And Bev had just been elected as the caucus leader. She's a former Speaker of the House.
Yep.
And so she came in the Senate, and she was well liked in her caucus. So we thought, well, maybe we'll try with Bev, but that's where the John Minnis issue came out. What happened with Minnis, there was, I think it was 5 Republicans back in '95. They did an all-out revolt in the Republican caucus. And so what Bev did, she stripped all of them of their committees.
Was this like the kind of, what, I forget what the 94, the red wave, the sort of like Newt Gingrich faction gets.
So these 5 people, you might, today they have the Freedom Caucus or whatever, but anyway, they had a group of 5 people that they said, this is how we're going to run things. And
Bev just strips them.
Bev said no. So none of you have any committee responsibilities anymore. Well, 4 of them kind of came crawling back and apologized, but not Minnis. Minnis said no. And so when her name was brought up, and keep in mind, I served with John Minnis, and he was Judiciary Chair when I was on Judiciary Committee. John, what he said, you could trust what he was going to say, whether you liked it or not. And John just said, hey, if it's going to be Clarno, I'm voting for Kate Brown. And it was like, okay, well, there goes that one. We have only any more choices left, right? Because none of the rest of us like any of the rest of us enough to vote for us. So,
and Peter was perceived as that, he had some experience in the building. He was sort of a moderate figure,
and so Bev had worked with Peter because he was the Democratic leader in the House at the time she was Speaker, so they had to work together a lot. What actually happened on that, this is interesting, another part that I didn't write about, but during this attempted coup in the Republican caucus back in '95, they were going to try to get her out as Speaker.
Okay.
And now I don't have this on firsthand knowledge. I heard this from some of the interviews I did because I was not a part of that. But I had at least 2 people tell me this, is that something along the line was Peter had a conversation with Bev Clarno and said, if these guys try that, we're going to vote for you.
Oh, Peter said he could deliver Democratic votes to keep Bev Clarno
in the chair if they were to pull that stunt.
And that
So,
that could have earned him some big time points with Bev
and
to think I can work with them
I
on the
think
same
that
side.
earned points with Bev, and so she remembered that when it came time to somebody that I could trust that would run this and and not run roughshod over us, and
So
so
yeah, so this idea happens. The people in the room, whoever these sort of delegates from the two caucuses are, kind of basically say, yeah, this is what we're going to do. And then I think you describe it's Senator Ginny Burdick runs into Kate Brown in the hallway after this meeting. What exactly happens there?
well, they met each other in on the Senate wing. You have the staircase and you have the elevator. Well, she was going down the staircase and she ran into Kate. And this was right after Bev had delivered the news that the caucus would vote for Peter Courtney. And so they ran into each other in the hallway, and it was a very emotional time. Obviously, Kate had just got that news, and Ginny and Kate were pretty close, and she'd been fighting really hard for Kate for 2 months, for being Senate president, and so it was just an emotional moment. I thought it was a very touching moment. They just really didn't talk. Ginny said they just kind of started crying, and because I mean she had worked so hard for that, and Ginny knew that. Um, but she was a good statesperson in stepping aside, knowing that Republicans are going to give us, the Democrats,
Well,
presidency of the Senate in a tied Senate, and you know, even though it's not me, I've got to be able to react. And
I was going to say, Kate Brown comes across in your essay as like incredibly statesmanlike and graceful, and she's basically the protagonist in the Democrats retaking the Senate, and for political reasons isn't able to have it at the moment. So, and it's actually Kate Brown who tells Peter, right? Kate says, Peter, call your family. You're about to get sworn in.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was an amazing thing. If you can imagine that, it'd be like you. I mean, you go in there and someone walks in and say, you're going to be the Speaker of the House, and I have no staff. I've got no. And what do you mean? Someone's going to swear me in 4 hours? I have to give a speech. How am I going to write a speech? So it was just chaos, and I could just imagine how uh, Peter's face in that moment is, it's just like, all heck was breaking loose, and totally not prepared for that, and so
So,
uh,
so that
that's how
actually,
it kind of went down.
so I'm going to read a direct excerpt from your essay. The first paragraph is this is what Peter Courtney said in his speech on the floor of the Senate. And then I'm going to read a couple sentences you write and kind of ask you to weigh in and help us understand what this means. So Peter Courtney, sort of out of nowhere, becomes Senate president. He gets sworn in and he gives a speech. And this is what he says in the speech. I also want to acknowledge Senator Kate Brown. We've been through a lot, and I know that in this audience today, each of you bring to what we've just done varying degrees of support and opposition. Senator Brown has acted in a way that I envy. She has shown a degree of true public service in taking herself out of a situation that she has spent so long pursuing. I hope she understands that I stand before her today as an individual who realizes that while I am the president now, I am simply a shared president. So that's Peter Courtney's quote. And then here's what you add in the essay. That last sentence would be the subject of different interpretations in the months and years ahead. Was Courtney saying that if Democrats had a clear majority, he believed Brown should be president? Or is he trying to comfort a respected colleague who needed a word of encouragement? What do you think? What do you think is behind that statement?
Well, obviously, anything that Kate or Peter said between each other with nobody else is something that none of us will ever really know.
Right.
I think that in retrospect, you have to look at it in place and time. If at the moment on that day, when that all came down, there's not a lot of plotting about, let me think about 2 years from now, right? It's just kind of like we're just moving ahead, and I think that everybody understood that our nominee was Kate Brown, and that but the circumstances, the way they played out, this is how it's going to be. So, no one got together, ever had votes, or, I mean, keep in mind, two people can't determine who the Senate president is, but
Right.
caucus
Yep.
determines that. Right.
Yep.
So, but I think if you were to ask anybody at the time, before the session starts, right, after on that first day or second day, there probably would be assumption, well, I'm sure that if we win total, it'll be cake. I mean, just like the assumption would be. But as you know how politics is, it's also
That
things
doesn't always,
change.
yeah, things change.
Yeah.
So
it changes. And, and then we have a session in which Peter gets tremendous accolades for how he's running the session. And as I mentioned, he really earned the trust of the caucus. And those are individual stories, where people have to face some issues, and Peter had their back in private situations or things like that. And that changes things.
So there's two, yes. So there's two things happening at the same time. One is Peter Courtney is Senate president, and things are going pretty well. Like you say, the media is loving it. Political observers are loving it. Most senators are feeling like he's doing a good job, and he's sort of balancing things. And at the same time, Kate Brown is still the caucus leader for the Democrats and is actively, after the session, I'm sure, but she's recruiting candidates. She's raising money. She's putting in the work to actually take back the Senate. Peter's doing some of this too. There's this story about how a lobbyist who a lot of people know, Jack Dempsey, is working at SDLF, and they're both like working through Jack to figure out how much did Peter raise, how much did Kate raise. They're competing against each other. I don't know if it's explicitly or implicitly, but they're both trying to be the sort of like leader of the Senate Democrats to position themselves for Senate president.
It was by that time, it was obvious to all of us that Peter was going to be running again, right? I mean, because he was diving in full, both feet in, just like Kate, and trying to make the caucus, the responsibility of the caucus to show that he's in this for the campaign as well as for the session for them, to build his creds up with Kate. And so there was no doubt that when we got together in November, this was going to be a confrontation.
So, okay, so 2004 election happens, and it's actually an insanely good election for Senate Democrats. They win 3 additional seats. It's 18-12, clear majority in the Senate. And then, as some of our listeners know, basically after the elections happen, all 4 caucuses have basically, we call them retreats, I think, like caucus retreats. Yours is in Salishan, at the coast. They're
still doing Salishan. I guess they can't figure out any other place exists in Oregon, I guess.
So all the Senate Democrats go to Salishan. Before we talk about, because what happens at Salishan is, to me, just fascinating. But before we get to the actual vote, you as a senator going to Salishan, do you think you know what's going to happen? Do you think you know where the votes are? Or are people going in saying, who the hell knows who our caucus leader is going to be?
I didn't know. I don't think anybody knew. And in fact, when you got the vote, you could see that, I mean, I knew it was going to be divisive.
There was not a sense of like, oh, we're coming to celebrate together. We had this big win. It was like no one knew who the Senate president was going to be, and people were like nervous about this.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I remember I got calls. I know all my colleagues got calls from Peter and Kate asking for their support. And, for them, obviously some people said, yeah, I'll support you or not support you. But I do know that, a lot of us just said, we love you both. Let's wait until that day. I mean, you really didn't want to be committed because you just didn't know how this was going to go. And, and you wanted to hear what they had to say. And it was tough. I mean, I'm sure some of the people were really committed to one or the other, but I think there's about a third of the caucus that it was a really tough decision, weighing this versus this.
So, okay. So that's the mood going in. You should be celebrating. In a traditional election cycle, this would be a gigantic win for Democrats, but because of the politics, people are nervous. So the way this works procedurally is it's a secret ballot vote. So people basically get a slip of paper, I'm guessing, and they write a name on it.
Yeah.
So first round happens, they pass out the paper comes back in. It's 8 votes Brown, 8 votes Peter Courtney. Are the other 2 votes Brown and Courtney? They just don't vote, or why are you missing 2 votes?
Well, the assumption is they vote for themselves. So that's why I read 8 of their colleagues voted for them and 8 voted for them.
Okay, so it's a tie. It's 8-8.
Yeah.
They do a second round. They pass out the ballots again. Does anything happen in between? Do people give another round of speeches or anything?
No, there was no second round of speeches. Between the first and second ballot, as I recall, there wasn't much of anything. It was just like, oh wow,
Let's try
all right,
again.
let's try this again. It was after the second one where things got tense, you know.
And that's when you write that Senator Vicky Walker, who a gigantic figure in that period of Oregon politics, not just for this, but she was also a central figure in the Neil Goldschmidt story, as we recently talked to Nigel Jaquist about. I think she also got a federal position of some kind, didn't she, during the Obama years?
Yeah, she had. It was here in Oregon. It was, I think it was the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, a grant program. So she was running that out of Portland.
So she stands up in this closed door secret caucus meeting and basically says, come on, people, like we got to get this done. I think the quote is, come on, people, how are we going to show we can govern the state if we can't even decide how to govern ourselves?
That's so Vicky. And that's the one I recall the most. But there was other comments, that were made about different things. And so there was a little discussion there at that point. And but there was a real sense that, there had to be some movement. Of course, there's always the fear that, okay, Ben is going to move, and then Rick moves, and we still have a tie, right? I mean, so and so no one really knew how that was going to go. But when we voted for the third time,
right,
you're pulling the names out, you're reading it, Courtney, Brown, and it became clear that one had changed.
Are they reading the votes in front of everyone, or does a group take the votes to a separate room and
no, they're pulled right out in front of us and read.
So you know exactly how. Okay. So Peter Courtney wins by one vote because one person changes their vote from Brown to Courtney. Do we have any idea who did that?
We don't think we'll ever know. After talking to just about everybody, I have a suspicion. But I think part of the wonderfulness of this is that we don't really know.
There's some secrets that will continue to be secrets. Right. Okay, so the vote changes. Peter Courtney wins. What we'll get to the implications in a moment, but what happens in the room?
I just think there's I think it was actually kind of somber. I think even those who voted for Peter were, for the most part, sad for Kate, as it would have been on the other way around, right? So, it wasn't like people were depressed or anything, but it wasn't happy, go jolly, let's go out and have a few drinks and celebrate. It was kind of a somber, moment, and I think people respected the fact that how hard they both had worked. And we also had, as we had to go move right into selecting the majority leader. So now the question is, does Kate want to stay on as majority leader after being rejected, kind of twice now, for Senate presidency? And I don't know that anybody else wanted that job. It's a lot of work, So it was good that Kate, agreed to stay on as majority leader, but clearly she was very disappointed, and you can't blame her for that. I mean, she worked very hard to try to get there.
So there's this interesting tidbit earlier in the essay where you say at one point, Phil Kiesling is Secretary of State. He steps down early as Secretary of State, and no one's quite sure like who's going to get appointed to fill that seat.
Right.
A friend of Kate Brown goes to Kate and say, hey, you should put your name in the hat for Secretary of State. And her response is, and I quote, I don't want to be Secretary of State. I want to be Senate President. This is allegedly what she told this friend. So she wanted to be Senate President. Twice she gets rebuffed because of, weird shifting politics within the caucus. And as you write, she sort of redirects her route, eventually runs for Secretary of State. I believe Vicky Walker was in that election too, right? It was her, Vicky Walker. And you were, and then you
there was four of us in it. I finished second in that. I mean, it was like the whole Senate was running for Secretary of State. So yeah, that was a fun year. But Vicky was in that.
So Peter Courtney basically in that at Salishan has cemented his, I mean, obviously a lot of shifts and changes happened, but that's the beginning of his record-setting tenure. The longest Senate president in the history of Oregon is Peter Courtney. Kate Brown wins the primary for Secretary of State, wins the general election, gets reelected, and then of course we all know the story of Kitsauber resignation and how she gets elevated to be governor. Fascinating story. I'm curious why you decided to tell this story. There's, famously caucus meetings are private. People don't often know what's going on in those. There's sometimes whisper campaigns and people say certain things. It's clear that not only you, but sounds like you talked about just everyone else in your caucus, and everybody's kind of ready.
Well, I talked to the Republicans too.
So why did you decide to tell this story now, and why do you think so many of your colleagues were comfortable with what was at the time a deeply secret and sacred conversation becoming part of the public record?
Well, first of all, most of them, aren't being quoted.
Yeah, that's right.
I didn't quote anybody who I didn't ask. It was okay if I quoted you on something like Ginny, because it was very personal.
Yeah.
His history is important. I mean, there's a time for secrecy. I mean, this hasn't been talked about for 20 years. I mean, she's the governor. Peter's president of the Senate. They're active in things, and but just like with White House records or anything else, there is a point in which things need to be classified for history. And with Peter and Kate, both leaving now in the next 2 weeks, leaving that stage after those careers, I thought it was really important just for Oregon history for people to understand how these things happened, and to reflect on just how things happen in politics in general. They talked about how, people in political careers, that it's like an escalator on the way up. And as we've seen here locally, we've seen it nationally, we will continue to see it. It can be, and generally is, an elevator on the way down. It's just one day it's gone. And so people devote a lot of their lives to this and work very hard at it, and just the emotion of that. And I think it's really important to do that. And then it's also important to recognize that the role that fate plays in these things. You can't. And it's not just politics, in your own personal life, things happen that you didn't ever anticipate, and things happen, in your other job, life or whatever. That, it's the old, adage. I think it's true, when doors close, windows can open, and you have to be, able and nimble to react to that. And I think part of the story was Kate was nimble. She didn't sit there and just outed about it for the rest of her career. She's hold things together and said, all right, I'm going to try a different approach, and still try to do the best job I can. And Peter didn't assume that because he won that he could just kind of coast and think that's always going to happen again, that he had to continue to earn that of the chamber year after year, which he did. And so, while people's memories were still, acute enough to remember all these things, I think it's important for history to be able to record exactly, how these things actually happened.
Yeah.
There's a lot of other stories I'd like to know about what happened in other things. And, people with the first degree information on that, I'll be anxious to read myself sometime. But I think it's important for people to have a perspective on just how these things, come down.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, our audience is obviously Oregon political nerds, people whose job is Oregon politics or hobby is Oregon politics. So I think this is there's tremendous historical value to listeners. And, maybe we'll hear from, it'll be interesting to see if Governor Brown writes her memoirs, or Peter Courtney contributes to the public record in some way.
Yeah.
I mean, and they can kind of present their perspectives and sides of the story. But thank you for sharing with our listeners, because this wasn't just what I appreciate is it wasn't just, oh, this is what Rick Metsger remembers. It was you kind of doing some investigative reporting with your colleagues. My final question, I know we're coming up on time here, is, if you look back at the last 30 years, 40 years of Oregon politics, Kate Brown and Peter Courtney are right up there with people like John Kitzhaber in terms of their significant impact over a long period of time. Their names are on huge pieces of legislation, also political issues that weren't related to legislation, like they were at the center of a lot of it. When you think about what Kate Brown's legacy will be and Peter Courtney's legacy will be, maybe separately or together, what do you think they'll be remembered for? What do you think their greatest contributions will be to Oregon?
That's one thing that's really interesting, Ben, because, again, we talk about point in time.
Yeah.
One thing great about legacies, they change over time.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, for example, it was like back in 1951, the general thought of the day was Harry Truman was going to go down as the worst president in history. If you read some of the press back then and all that, and then he became revered. And for what he did and the stances he took, and his legacy, changed over time. I think
similarly, Rick, on that point, the book on my bedside right now is called His Very Best, and it's a book about Jimmy Carter. And it's the same concept, this idea of like, oh, Jimmy Carter.
That's another one.
Yeah.
He's been more beloved since he was president.
Right.
Because they say, I wish we had somebody with that character, in the White House. So
exactly.
So with that in mind, I'd say a couple of things with Peter. Peter's sincerity in doing the work that he did. His love for the institution. I mean, that is, I don't know, how anybody would ever match that. He really lived and breathed the decorum of the Senate. And as I wrote, I know it's been anguishing for him because he's felt some of that eroding. But I think he'll be remembered for that. I think he'll also be remembered, and this is more inside the political world, as one who put his members first over the lobbyists. And I heard this from a lot of my colleagues who I talked to about this. You listen to all the information and everything else, but he wasn't swayed by the lobby. He was swayed by the argument, but he was also swayed by the convictions of his fellow colleagues in the Senate. And no one felt that, it was some money broker that was deciding the policy that Peter was going to go moving on. I've never heard anybody, I've heard from a lot of people about different people, but never about Peter Courtney, like, oh, he's just doing it to chase the money from this group or that group. Which never was Peter Courtney. So I think his sincerity in addressing his job, and the respect for government, just government in general. And I think with Kate, I think she's going to go down as certainly as a very powerful majority leader, who was tenacious in advancing democratic principles. I mean, with the big D, in this case, the Democratic Party principle. Number one, I think she'll get a lot better reception on the whole COVID thing as time passes on. It's divided the whole country in many, many ways, and so I don't envy anybody, and certainly not Kate, for having been in that situation the last few years, dealing with everything that had to deal with, and having to make decisions that no matter what you decided, you're going to make a lot of people angry. I think history will be a lot better on her in terms of how she handled COVID. On the other hand, it's really detracted from what may have been in terms of policy and other things, because it was so all consuming. We didn't really have a chance to really see Kate Brown with a in a normal 4-year cycle, what she may or may not have been able to deliver. So but I think it'll be much more kinder when you see how the state actually did compared to other states in the whole COVID deal. But it was a rough ride.
Yeah. Well, Rick, I just want to say thank you for spending the last hour telling this story and sharing with our listeners some of the inside baseball from really, I mean, that was a transformative moment in our state, and it set the trajectory that led us to today. So I really appreciate you sharing the story with our listeners.
It's fun to do that, and look forward to your service. Enjoy every minute of it.
Thank you. Thank you. So last question, if maybe folks have a question or they want to get in touch with you, is the PacWest website the best place, or how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, well, they can send me an email. It's just Metsger, but I always have to remind people is with an S, like in the New York Mets, Metsger. Metsger at pwlobby.com. And, we'll answer your questions. We have people operators standing by to take them right now. And if you call right now, we'll actually give you 2 sets. A couple extra Ginsu knives.
If you call right now, he'll tell you who he thinks flipped their vote in the caucus meeting. All right, Rick, thanks again for coming on the podcast, and we'll see everyone next week.